as some of you may be aware, there's a little workshop at the end of the very program where I'll be talking a little bit more about the mechanics of how RTI happens. So I've actually omitted most of that from my presentation today. So there's a photograph in front of you now of my kit doing in action, but I'm afraid I'm going to spend more time talking about the seals and the metadata. So just keep that in mind. Okay. Here we go. So, in medieval England, men and women of a wide range of different standings used seals to authenticate records. Those seals preserve words and images, and thus offer scholars, including historians, art historians, and archaeologists, an opportunity to explore the ideas, values, and beliefs of a large and diverse group of people. Seals are an important part of the medieval documentary legacy, but scholars, as well as members of the general public, have little personal experience generally working with them. Moreover, only a fraction have been catalogued, and those catalogues are difficult to search in a systematic fashion. Thus, medieval seals, despite their vivid and attractive images, occupy a corner of the dark archives. However, technology, and in particular, Reflectance transformation imaging, may now offer a way to bring these seals to wider attention. So, start with a little bit of history. In later medieval England, seals were common. In the 12th century, people did not assume that a person of some standing would have a seal, but this had changed by the beginning of the 13th century, when people started routinely using seals to authenticate important records. As Harvey and McGuinness have argued, by the early 13th century, the people who needed seals included, quote, everyone who had free land or property to convey, or other business to be agreed in formal writing. Moreover, Clancy has suggested that since small landowners were recording exchanges in writing, by 1300, quote, it seems reasonable to conclude that at least hundreds of thousands and perhaps millions of peasants' charters were made. As the practice of sealing records produced in medieval England continued on through the 14th and 15th centuries, the number of sealed records produced in medieval England must have been vast. A fraction of those records survive today, and as a seal is more fragile than parchment, only a fraction preserve their seals. Nonetheless, the number of surviving seals is significant. The precise number of surviving medieval seal impressions is actually still unknown, because they have never been systematically counted. Today, in England, the most common type of medieval record that preserves seals are property conveyances. Hundreds of repositories, including local record offices, libraries, cathedrals, university colleges, and even hospitals, can hold collections of medieval property records. So at the National Archives, for example, in the mid-20th century, archivists surveyed a sample of their records to estimate the resources they needed to complete a catalog of their medieval seals. They selected the Ancient Deeds collection, which contains approximately 65,000 records dating to before 1600. And they concluded that the collection alone might contain more than 25,000 seals. At the end of the 20th century, Paul Harvey estimated the National Archives could have 50,000 examples, and that in England there could be several hundreds of thousands. Stepping back on a larger European scale, in 1981, a French scholar, Michel Pastoureau, speculated that, quote, the number of impressions of seals that survive from before the 16th century that have passed down to us is immense, perhaps on the order of 2 or 3 million for the whole of Western Europe. So, no one knows how many medieval seals survive, but what is certain is that it's quite a significant number. And I think today no one would be surprised if it proved to be larger than 3 million. So, if the total number of seals is uncertain, perhaps we could at least calculate how many have been catalogued. So let's give that a go. Let's start with the National Archives. At the National Archives in 1913, William St. John Hope established a card catalog, which succeeding generations of archivists have gradually expanded. Based on this card catalog, Roger Ellis, between 1979 and 1986, published 3 volumes in what was then envisaged as a series of printed catalogs that would provide access to the sigillographic collections. This is what you've got on your screen right now, some information about that cataloging effort. He got through about 5,800. Towards the end of the 20th century, they switched to a digital first idea, and Paul Harvey prepared a digital catalog that focused on the Duchy of Lancaster collections and the Auditors of Land Revenue collections. And Paul Harvey gave us about 4,000 or so seals. And most recently, I did a little volume for the London Record Society, which focused on London seals, and that includes some material from the TNA, and I'm contributing about 600 or so. So in total, you're looking at something like around 10,000 or so seals for the National Archives that have been properly and completely cataloged. So if their collections had 50,000 and we've done about 10,000, that means we're still waiting for 40,000 to be done. The situation of the British Library may be similar. Walter the Great Birch surveyed seals in the British Library, previously the British Museum, and published his findings in 6 volumes between 1887 and 1900. And his catalog describes more than 16,000 seals. So it is the single largest published catalog of seals in the United Kingdom. Yet it includes only a fraction of the library's holdings, and it is not a representative sample. Birch prioritized seals with a high grade of workmanship and seals of notable people and institutions. So the seals in the catalog, in other words, are probably the tip of the iceberg, and I don't know how deep that iceberg goes. So in 2 of the institutions in England that have the longest traditions of supporting sigillography, perhaps 26,000 seals have been recorded, and that is clear it's only a portion of their collections. So if we step outside the 2 big players in London, there are other local and smaller repositories that have made more progress in cataloging their collections. For example, in the early 20th century, Greenwell and Blair published a catalog of seals in the collections of the Dean and Chapter of Durham Cathedral. The catalog has about 8,000 entries, and it covers all types of seals in the collection. So it includes seals of kings, bishops, and the nobility, but also the seals of humble men and women who only held small plots of land. The Dean and Chapter of Durham Cathedral were fortunate to have 2 exceptionally dedicated scholars to survey its collections. Other institutions have not benefited from the same level of attention. Some institutions have finding aids that cover the totality of their collections, more or less, but those finding aids have not yet been converted into finished catalogs. Here, for example, is an index slip for the seals of Westminster Abbey, whose collections are probably somewhat similar in nature to those of Durham. Index slips are hugely valuable, but you have to go to the Monument Room to access them. And these descriptions that you're going to find in these cards, of course, not finished polished pieces, they're provisional. Perhaps someday they will be converted into a finished polished catalog. But they're a step in that direction. More closer to home, I suppose, here. In a similar way, in Oxford, at the Bodleian Library, there is a hand list of seals. It offers relatively little information about those seals, but it does assign them an identifier, and that is a very good starting point. At other institutions, the process of creating finding aids has hardly even begun. As these cases suggest, the amount of effort that has gone into recording seals varies dramatically from institution to institution, and considerable work remains to be done to document what seals exist and where they are located. So repositories need to record the locations of seal impressions so they can be retrieved and accessed. But let's now imagine a future where every repository has a seal catalog. Just imagine. When that happens, given the number of seals that have been estimated to exist, scholars will be buried under a mountain of data. If every catalog had to be searched independently, it would be impossible to work through the material in an efficient and systematic way. So the aim of the DigiSig project, which is sort of my thing, which is currently underway in St. Louis, is to collect together the existing seal catalogs to study the problems involved in making all those catalogs searchable through a common interface. At the moment, through DigiSig, scholars can access something like 40,000 seals. And DigiSig incorporates many of the major published seal catalogs in England at the moment, but the project is ongoing, and work on the more informal finding aids, such as the various hand lists, has hardly even begun. Therefore, we are far from gathering the existing records for seals in England, and even further from having records for all the seals that currently survive in England. But we are making progress in developing systems to manage that information and make it searchable. In the future, the quantity of sigillographic data may pose a challenge for researchers. But the tradition of separating information about seals from information about the documents to which they are associated will also have to be addressed. Here's an example of a catalog entry from the National Archives from one of Roger Ellis's volumes of personal seals. And you can see here that we've got a name, we've got some description of what the seal is about, some transcription of the legend, size, shape, color, and then we have this list of document numbers here. And we have this one mysterious date up in the top corner here. That date is this document here. It's E42/32. Because Ellis didn't have enough room to give you all the information about the dates of all these other documents, he doesn't give it to you. He just omits that. There's just one date up here. And these have different dates. So this isn't a very good way of accessing the full information about the context that this object originally had. If you want to know that, you have to go to the catalogs and look up those entries for all the other documents yourself. The way images of seals are often presented also serves to detach them from their documentary contexts. Here, for example, is a set of plates from Birch's catalog of seals at the British Museum. And they're lovely for comparing seals, but they're completely isolated from those documents. And some institutions have even taken the further step of not only just notionally separating seals from their documents, but actually physically doing it. So, for example, by the later 19th century, the Bodleian Library had accumulated a very important collection of medieval deeds, which preserved more than 3,000 seal impressions. In 1878, the seals were described by Turner and Cox as, quote, worthy of special attention, some of them being, so far as is known, unique specimens of their kind. By the end of the century, the decision had been made to transform the way in which they were stored. In 1900, the curators announced that, quote, the many hundreds of loose charters and rolls relating to the United Kingdom were bound up. In the process, the parchments were pressed flat, mounted on sheets, and then bound together into large volumes containing dozens of documents. To preserve the seals, they were removed by cutting through the tags and cords which appended them to the records. The seals were then stored in boxes, which is what you have here. And here's an example. The seals were removed to conserve them, but it had the effect of transforming the seal impressions from features of documents, as they had been intended by their original owners, into fully independent works. Perhaps it could be argued that there were practical reasons for separating seals in the documents, and it also suited the way in which the seals were studied in the 19th and into the 20th centuries. Nonetheless, such cataloging and conservation strategies serve to promote an understanding of the seal and the text as separate works, rather than parts of a whole. So that's something we're going to have to resolve. Another problem is that seals are a form of printed material. Seals are made using stamps, known as seal matrices. Individuals might use the same seal for decades, while institutions could keep a seal for centuries. And during that time, they might use it repeatedly. It would go on to many different documents. And those might, by chance, still survive. However, most seal impressions are damaged. Before scholars can discuss a seal, they have to gather the impressions to ensure they have all the available information. Based on textual catalog entries, such work is very difficult because textual descriptions of seal imagery cannot capture the particular characteristics of that imagery and the nature of the objects. Thus, textual catalog entries can be very suggestive, but they cannot be used on their own to prove that two seal impressions came from the same seal matrix. So, creating more seal catalogs would be progress, as would be creating links between seal records and document records, but we still need images of the seals so that we can start to consider if examples surviving in different repositories might be of the same work. Now, photography is the standard tool right now for imaging seals. Sigillographers have been using cameras for more than a century. We've already looked at Birch's use of it at the very beginning of the 20th century, in the late 19th century even. Although photography, of course, is very valuable, it is not an ideal way to record the three-dimensional features of a wax seal impression. As scholars examining a seal impression in person will adjust the angle of the light because the shadows cast upon the relief will accentuate or minimize various features and thus make them more legible. A photograph, therefore, which has light fixed in a particular place, shows what features the photographer thought were important, and it represents a particular interpretation of that seal. The appearance of digital cameras in the 1990s dramatically decreased the cost of photography, removing this obstacle for imaging large collections. But it also opened up the possibility of creating entirely new kinds of images. Among these is something we're going to call Reflectance Transformation Imaging, or RTI, which was invented at HP Laboratories. RTI is a computational photography technique based on a set of photographs of an object taken from a fixed camera position, but with light from various known directions. The photographs are then combined within the software to produce a dynamic visualization that enables a user to simulate the appearance of the object with light from any direction. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment. But just as an example of what a scholar might do with this, here is the seal of Richard, son of Gilbert of Pembroke, which dates to the 12th century. Here's a photograph of the document. This is the obverse, this is the reverse actually here. And this particular seal has sort of tantalized 12th century scholars for decades because it has been argued it shows some of the very earliest evidence for heraldry. It has been claimed that there are heraldic markings on this shield. The problem is that this particular impression is in the collection of the Huntington Library, which is in California. So those of us who don't get to California very often don't have much of a chance to see this. So until very recently, your main point of access to this seal was through this photograph, which was published, and because the light was in a certain angle, it doesn't really show you what was on that seal. So 2 years ago, I asked the archivist to create an RTI of it, and then I moved the light around a bit and took this screenshot. And I think you can probably see there it's catching these little lines on the shield a little bit better. So this is one of the potential applications of this sort of technology. So from the perspective of scholars, there is a strong case for adopting RTI. An RTI is made from photographs, so the process is non-invasive, and the resulting RTI more faithfully records the appearance of the original object than a single illustration or textual description. So I'm just going to quickly conclude and then go to the website, because I think that's probably what people want to do. So, to rescue seals from the dark archives, we need to do a number of things. the repositories need to finish identifying the seals in their collections. Each seal impression needs an identifier so it can be discovered. Furthermore, each seal impression also needs to be linked to the record for the document where the seal impression survives, and we need the records for the various seals to be linked together. Finally, we also need to photograph the seal impressions so that information about their appearance is preserved and made available. However, because seal impressions are not flat, but rather objects with complex surfaces, we need something like RTI to do this imaging. So, if I can quickly get out of this, show you how the actual thing works here. So, for example, here's the live DigiSeq website. I've just pulled up one of my examples, and you can see with my mouse here, I'm just moving the light around this object. So, one of the games here is to ask people what they think this poor woman is holding. It's a fish, yes. So, if you're really interested in fish on seals, this might be a good one for you. Here you go, fish. And I have a whole selection of other ones down here you could play with, if you like. And just to show you how this process of linking works, if you click over here on the item record, it takes you to this page, which is giving you some information I've scraped from the TNA website. And it's showing you down here there actually are 2 seal impressions on this object. And we could, if we wanted to, we could just click there, and it would take you right to the page in the archive for it. If we go back, we want to read the seal entry for this. You would see that there's 2 people who have cataloged it. Ellis has done one version, and you can see what he said about it, if you'd like. Or you can go back to the seal entry page and see where there are other examples of this seal. E42 is the one you just looked at, but it's also an E40 and E42493. So RTI sort of is the linchpin of all this, I think. It's nice as it is to have all this linked data. We also need to see the object. And we can get back to it. I think this is our crucial technology for seals. That's my argument anyway. Thank you.
Thanks, John. We've got time for a couple of questions from us.
Okay.
Yeah.
Photographic question, not least following on from the fact that we've already heard that actually digital photography remains inferior to film photography in terms of quality. How many photographs do you take of each object?
It works with about 30. I usually take about 50 for redundancy purposes.
Okay.
But because it's digital, it doesn't really matter how many you can take. You can take 50 in 3 minutes. It doesn't take very long. So you just take a whole bunch of photographs, give it the software, it works out what it wants to show you.
Okay. And the software, is it widely available?
It's free, open source.
Open source?
Yep.
From HP? Or?
It's from the Cultural Heritage Institute in California, and they were funded by a U.S. grant-giving agency to create this. So.
Yeah, for runic inscriptions, this is what you need as well on objects, small objects that you can then move and see from different angles.
It will be very helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. It's particularly good for inscriptions on all scales because you can see things, change the lights on different angles.